Welcome to the Faces podcast. We're a Christian and Muslim charity working to build resilience in faith communities against child sexual exploitation and other forms of harm. We'll be talking about what faith and interfaith work means to us and how we embed an inclusive and authentic approach throughout our work.
Welcome to our podcast. Melissa and I are meeting with Peter Adams today. And Peter Adams runs a reconciliation ministry out of St. Mary's in Luton, among many other things that Peter does. And so we'd like to talk to you today, Peter, a little bit about your reconciliation work, maybe a little bit of how it began. How does someone like you get involved in mediation and reconciliation? What drives you? What got you to this point? Where did it start? Where did it all begin?
Hi, Nigel. Hi, Melissa. Great to be talking. How did it all begin? I mean, I've worked with the church, with Christian groups, most of my career, most of my adult life. I found myself very early on using my academic background in teaching on the history of ideas. I quickly began to look at the way that Western ideas impacted other nations through colonialism and through mission, and particularly through mission. The way that, we took Western worldviews, Western culture, Western ideals, and imposed them upon many nations. Mm. But also the unacceptable stuff of slavery and, through colonialism and, the wars of colonialism and so on, the trading practices and all. And I found myself being invited to teach, because I wasn't living there, teach week-long courses on the history of colonialism and mission and the impact of Western ideas through that. In Africa, various African nations, in India, in South America, in the Pacific Islands, in New Zealand and Australia, and in Southeast Asia, and eventually worked in China on this. Teaching in Christian Bible colleges, seminaries and so on. But as I did that, I found myself opening up, a well of emotions in people who were hearing me. And people saying, actually, often the last day of a week of teaching would be almost processing this and would be real reconciliation going on. As people saw the heart of somebody coming from a culture that had done unacceptable stuff, but actually saw something reaching out, and some amazing stories, really. And it gradually opened up to me the area of intercultural relations and why things happen the way they happen in the world today, not just, when cultures get together and things that actually impact nations, and the way nations conduct each other, the way diplomacy carries on. I asked a diplomat once how much training they got in intercultural relations, and basically it was a big round zero. And you can see how many cultural faux pas take place just purely when that sort of thing happens. So I gradually found myself doing more and more teaching on intercultural relations, but also particularly intercultural conflict. And so I began to train in mediation and conflict mediation. And it was about, I suppose, by about 2000, I realized that, this was a very clear sense of vocation, calling from God to be a peacemaker. So I began to train in mediation. But it was a long preparation time. I remember going out on a walk when everything was coming together, walk out in the mountains, and I felt the voice. I mean, it's one of those few instances when I really sensed I felt God speaking to me very directly. So, you want to be a peacemaker? And I said, yes. And it was almost like I had a mirror held up to me. And the first thing about being a peacemaker was self-awareness, because I wasn't naturally a peaceable person. Melissa, you're smiling. Yeah, and I had to deal with a lot of self. And I found myself going through conflict with friends, with colleagues. I wasn't seeking conflict, but actually it was like I had to get in touch with conflict. And the thing is me that stirred conflict.
So are you saying until you have peace yourself, you haven't got it to bring to others?
Certainly until you've begun to deal. I don't think we're ever totally there. Mm-hmm. But for me, that journey was very much started with a real self-awareness. And how I stirred conflict in others and what I did to others. And that it was a particularly focused piece for about 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But then it's always continued. And actually, you can say something to me, Melissa can say something, and it will often be the people who are those who are not in positions of power who will say something, and it just holds up a mirror, and So I actually found myself with my colleagues, Africans, Indians, who I badly hurt, who I was working with at the time, and I badly hurt them. And I had to, go through a process of learning and learning and learning. And that's been a part of my journey. And so actually by about, I sensed that we need to come and live and work in a multicultural community. And we started worshipping at St Mary's in Luton, where we still worship now. We came there because I'd met the vicar at the time, and he said, come and work with us. We always need somebody working conflict resolution and, group intercultural work in Luton. Come and work with us. He said, I can't pay you, but I can find money. I can look for funding. So we started worshipping at St Mary's in 2003 and moved to Luton in 2007. And that's been, that was how it happened. The first year or two, I was just sort of, got in touch got to know the Luton Council of Faiths and the interfaith community, and got to know church leaders around the town, looking for where the place for me. And then a fateful day in early March 2009 saw a riot break out where a group of young men took exception, angry against some extremists from the Muslim community who were protesting against a group of soldiers who'd just come back from Iraq. It all went AWOL. And I found myself asking questions, talking to people, asking the right questions that helped people unpack that. And I haven't looked back. That group, incidentally, became the English Defence League, the far-right group. And so very quickly I found myself getting to know and understand what that was all about and why it was happening, or trying to understand why it was happening and so on. And basically I've dug my way into the life of Luton, really from that very key point. So that's a little bit of the story of how we got here, and the rest has just been unpacked and unfolded ever since.
I think one thing you said that's really, really powerful is that the idea of purpose, that people doing this kind of work, whether it's peace, reconciliation, conflict resolution, mediation, intercultural work, like all of that arena that you do so well together, and all of those different moving parts, it really takes people who are that dedicated, that know that actually this is somewhat of a calling, somewhat of actually what you have to stick with, and there is no kind of opt-out. option. There is no option to kind of just leave it.
No.
And I think, like you said, that just as when you came, there was place for you because of the kind of the landscape and because there was no one else doing that work. I think similarly, you couldn't just stop doing it now because it would leave such a big gap in meeting that need here in Luton and in sort of surrounding areas, as we were talking about before we started recording. But I didn't know that story, so I'm actually really glad that I've heard that story, Peter. I didn't know kind of how it started, so thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Melissa. I mean, I think what you've described there is perhaps it describes how I feel about what I do. People say, when are you going to retire? And my answer is, I couldn't. You can't retire from this sort of thing. It's about relationships, primarily. And I can't retire. You can't retire from relationships. You can't retire from your place in the community. Yes, I could move, but actually that would be cutting myself off from everything that's dear and, because actually that sense of purpose, that vocation, that calling, everything, all of that, and the relationships that it's opened up are my life. Where can you look? Where else could I go? This is what it's about for me. I feel I was made for it. And I really can. There are times, we were talking before this began, and we might get there again. We were talking about what we were doing Nigel and I were doing last night. I get back from a time like that, and it can be stressful. But actually, I have a sense I was made for this. And yeah, I don't like it when there's conflict, but when I'm actively in, and I don't go looking for it, and then if I know there's conflict, I don't want to go there. But actually, when I'm in a place where it is, it's just like I was made for this situation. And I can't say it any other way than that. So, but what you just said there, were just so beautifully summed it up. Thank you. I think I'm going to clip those words, and I'll probably have to play them back to Anne, because Melissa has just described to me why I can't retire from this, dear. She'll be round to see you.
That's all right. I'm sure we can come to an understanding. Yeah.
But I think the other thing you say there is that self-awareness and what that means. One of the things that obviously this is all about is a white, educated man of a certain age has power. And actually, for me, that journey of the mirror was about my relationship, with the mirror standing in front of me for several years, almost like it never moved, was a journey about realizing my power as a man, as an educated man, as a white man, in many different situations, and what that power meant. And that's deeply painful when you realize what it does and how it gets in the way of a relationship. Mm. And so I will often say, and you've heard me banging on about this in the Faces context. So much of what we're doing is all about the relationships. And what makes Faces unique is that the key people who've made Faces, who started it, are people I've worked with closely over 10, 12, 13, 14 years now, and actually been through really rough times together, but they are very, very good friends. And it's those relationships that have come through those difficult times that, you just don't leave behind. And they enter everything you do. And I think Faces has emerged out of that. For me, it's emerged out of those close relationships that allow us to talk about and do lots of things,
I think the idea of the mirror and of relationships, I suppose, is just really key to this as well, because even with groups that you're trying to create peace between or find reconciliation between, both of those are really important. It needs to be about relationship, not ideas, not even rights and wrongs. I suppose for a lot of the time, it needs to just be about understanding relationship and perspectives and difference, and kind of accepting to certain levels that that's okay to have difference. And that the mirror, I suppose from each side, whether we're talking about the far right or those that they're protesting against or whoever it is, both sides need to have that mirror to see actually what is it that I'm really saying? How can what I'm saying be perceived as well? And kind of just understanding the full circle of all of those implications. So it's all really helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I sort of am listening to this and thinking that long process of preparation earthed you in the community, but also did things in you as a person, which had a long build-up to what appeared on the surface. And I think in some ways that deeper work, I'm so glad it's not like a bookish schoolboy, I learned this little lesson and I'm going to be a peacekeeper. It's got to come from a gravitas. Yeah. It's got to come from a weight. And so I just think, knowing that you've had your eye on other parts of the world, there's peacekeepers needed in loads of communities around. And I know you want to inspire them. Is there advice you would give to people looking to be peacekeepers in their own communities? I know you've been over to Ireland, into some of the settings there, between Protestant and Catholic, or Unionist and Nationalist is probably more accurate, and some of those settings. Just wondered if there's something you can share that inspire further peacekeeping in different areas, because if it has to be rooted, there's some skills that can be transferred, but there's something of being in the community that's so important.
Yeah, before we lose those words, being in the community, those were the words Nick Bell, who was the vicar at St Mary's, said to me. So if you're going to come and work in Luton, you need to live in Luton. Can't live in Harpenden, Hitchin. You've got to live in Luton. If you're going to get into the heart of the community here. And that was really important. So it's that being in, the Christian idea of incarnation, being born into something, taking on the flesh of something, living it, being in the midst of it. That's really important. Relationships. Yeah. I think very simple. I have what I call a toolkit. The obvious pieces in that are training in mediation. You learn skills. Sort of 2-day standard mediation training course, about 14, 15 hours of material is what's generally offered in, how to do mediation between two neighbours, who are grumbling and moaning about the height of the hedge between the two houses, or who are dealing with parking issues or noise or, antisocial behaviour, those sort of things. That's the standard course that people do to deal with conflict. And I've done all of that. Then there's Mediation Northern Ireland. You talked about the Northern Ireland situation. Mediation Northern Ireland was formed out of a desire to work out how to bring communities together as a result of the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998 and all of that journey, that process. And they took basic principles and a key trainer in peacemaking, John Paul Lederach, who's an American guy, from a peace church tradition, a number of churches that were very formed in the ideas of early Mennonite ideas and so on. I won't go into all of that, but Lederach is somebody who really is the guru of peacemaking. And Lederach helped them and keeping the community there, developed ideas of how to bring communities together around faith issues of conflict, around conflict in the culture, And they do training on what they call civic mediation, which is bringing groups together, and is really complex because you do a mediation like that, and it's headbanging stuff because you've got all the individuals that make up a group versus all the other individuals make up another group, and often you've actually got a threefold conflict as well. It's really complex stuff. So those are all tools, that's skills that you can learn. But actually within that, the key things it comes down to are being prepared to look at yourself, that's the mirror, being prepared to listen to others, not being quick to ascribe blame, but listening and seeking to understand. A number of key, really toolkit pieces that are about attitude and how you relate to somebody. And actually, I find those, for myself as a Christian, I find them in the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't point the finger. That's in there. Forgive, apologize. Things like that. Pray for those who persecute you. Actually, there's something about prayer in terms of reaching out to somebody. When you pray before God, you have to have a clean heart. And that actually means that you see the person as God sees them, rather than as I see them with all my imperfections and all my attitudes. So things like that are just very simple pieces in, as I say, in the Sermon on the Mount. So if I taught my simple teaching series on becoming a peacemaker, it focuses on the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. So those are some key attitudes, but then you learn skills and so on that build upon those. And it's interesting how much those skills, this obviously partly comes from the fact that John Paul Lederach, who has often developed a lot of this stuff, is a Christian. And he's finding his inspiration in Scripture. But actually, you find they are human values as well. They're about relational values that just have so much wisdom in them that they don't stop in a Christian life. They extend to everybody, So those are some of the things I would respond to you with.
Thanks, Peter. And I think Faces is one of the fruits of some of your efforts and others' efforts all coming together and tackling difficult issues. And I think that's fantastic to be working with Faces and be part of all of that. But there's years behind that have led to that point.
Yeah.
And I think that's very exciting. And the future of things is exciting.
And for me, that sort of began. I began working with Sujal, with Sufyan back in 2010. Some of their colleagues more widely in 2009. I look back at pictures of Sujal and Sufyan and myself after the very big English Defence League demo in 2011. There's a picture of us in the community centre in Bury Park after everything's done and dusted, sort of looking totally weary, but actually knowing very well that somehow we'd cracked this, and then Rahana came into the picture in 2015 when I met her in the lead up to a Britain First event, and so these people who are the heart of Faces have been people we've walked the journey with for years.
Yeah.
But the lovely thing is also that, you develop that place where you can have that really difficult conversations, because the Peace of Luton has been built upon difficult conversations and actually facing up to the realities rather than just, the response so often of politicians, and we find that, from the town hall and so on is, this is all little stuff. It'll go away, just move on. But actually, our response was, no, we need to have those difficult conversations. And actually, this is not about papering over problems, moving on to the next thing, because they'll always spring back on you. And that's the political temptation, I think. But we've got to get. So when one of the things we learned also was that we needed to listen to the voices of those on the far right, and to listen to the voices of those who were very radical in the Muslim community. What are the issues here? How can we speak to those? That's not to condone, not to affirm the things that they do that are wrong, dead wrong, but actually, what are the things that are driving them? And one of the things that the far right were talking about consistently, and I'm not going to bang on about it now, but actually they were talking about safeguarding. They were talking about abuse of women. And so we had to be able to respond to that. And so that began lots of conversations around the narrative of abuse of women. And that's how Faces emerged, because it was just one of those things we did that had to be looked at. But it's gone so much farther beyond that, and that's thrilling,
So you referred to the Sermon on the Mount, and I happen to know that in the Sermon on the Mount it says, "Blessed are the peacekeepers."
Yeah.
And so I just wonder if you could just, as a final question, really, just tell us, how have you been blessed as a peacekeeper? What has enriched your life? How would you say that is true for you?
I think really the relationships. Dear friends, who you've walked a long way with through very difficult situations. And actually, you trust your life. Sufyan and I standing before a baying crowd in Bury Park on the day that there's thousands of EDL people in the town centre, and you've got 1,500 young Muslim men sort of really angry, being told lies that the EDL are coming to get them, and they weren't. They were on their buses already going home. But and the police, because they were surging forward, the police giving us, 2 minutes to quieten them. And Sufyan got up, and then I was about to get up, but actually by that time it was done. Then the rumor had spread that was free food available, and so the crowd dispersed. But when you stand, when I stand with Sufyan, you look back to times like that. You look back to times in the Gold Command reference group, when actually the two of us were challenging the police about their things. You look to things you've done together, and actually there's so much wealth to those relationships, and you trust those people with your life. And so actually that's the key blessing, I would say. And actually loving Luton, I wouldn't live anywhere else. I was born a country boy, but now I live in one of the most multicultural cities in Britain. I wouldn't live anywhere else. I couldn't do anything else. That's the blessing of God for me, I think.
Well, thank you for sharing so much of your heart and so much of yourself with us, Peter. It's been a privilege to hear it, so thank you from us both, and we look forward to many happy times ahead as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Melissa.